With grueling tours in remote cities, oftentimes in bad weather, it's still never a complete surprise when we hear of musicians losing their lives in aviation disasters. Yet as common as these fatalities may seem, most of them could have easily been avoided if someone was around to ask, "Hey, have we taken every precaution to ensure this flight is 100% safe?" As you listen to the names we've compiled, take note of the one common factor shared by each of them. These deaths could have been prevented. Today, we're talking about the amazing musicians who have died in airplane crashes. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other music stories you would like to hear more about. Now, here are the tragic ends to so many great musicians. Rhoads' final flight in a stolen Beechcraft F-35 on March 19, 1982 started out as a joyride. 5 minutes after takeoff, the small aircraft he was riding shotgun in would speed into the garage of a Florida mansion, burst into flames, and take one of metal's greatest guitarists years before his prime. The man who was piloting the Beechcraft, Andrew Aycock, was also Osbourne's tour bus driver. Out of sheer boredom, with dulled senses from a night of heavy drug use, Aycock thought it would be funny if he flew over Osbourne's tour bus, where the singer was nursing a hangover from the previous night of drinking. Less than 5 minutes after Rhoads boarded, Aycock had flown over Ozzy's tour bus twice. On the third pass, the Beechcraft's left wing clipped the vehicle, sending the plane hurtling into the nearby mansion of the man who actually owned the airplane. Investigators estimate that Rhoads smashed into the cockpit's windshield, dying instantly. Ironically, the evening before Rhoads' death, the relatively clean-living guitarist scolded Ozzy for his excessive drinking and drug use. One of the last things he said to Osbourne was, "You'll kill yourself, you know, one of these days." Aaliyah died in a completely preventable airplane crash less than a minute after takeoff when her chartered twin-engine Cessna went down in clear skies with little wind, about 6:50 p.m. on August 25, 2001. It was a flight she hadn't planned on until the last minute. According to reports conducted by the coroner's office in the Bahamas, it was determined that the aircraft, a 2001 Marsh Harbor Cessna 402, had attempted to take off while heavily overloaded and was carrying one more passenger than it was certified for. With that known, another pilot, Louis Key, who happened to be on the runway while Aaliyah and her entourage were waiting to board, overheard the musician's crew arguing with Morales after he told them several times that there was too much weight for a safe flight. Key later testified that members of Aaliyah's entourage insisted that Morales allow them to board because they had to be in Miami later that evening. Morales gave in to the passengers, and to make matters worse, he had trouble starting one of the engines. The aircraft crashed shortly after takeoff, about 200 feet from the runway. Everyone on board perished instantly. Immediately after a gig at the Alpine Valley Music Theater in East Troy, Wisconsin, on August 27, 1990, Stevie Ray Vaughan boarded a Bell 206B helicopter with his agent, his bodyguard, and his tour manager. He had just stepped off the stage with Eric Clapton, Robert Cray, Buddy Guy, and his brother Jimmy in an all-star jam encore. En route to take Vaughan home, the helicopter didn't make it more than 3/5 of a mile before it collided head-on into a nearby ski slope, ending the lives of all 4 passengers and the pilot on impact. According to initial findings from an inquest conducted by the coroner's office, it was determined that foggy conditions were the main reason for the tragedy. Ultimately, though, the cause of the crash was attributed to the pilot, who wasn't licensed to fly a helicopter solely by instruments. Strangely enough, Vaughan told his bandmates the day before that he had had a disturbing dream where he witnessed his own funeral. During an afternoon flight on October 12, 1997, John Denver took his recently purchased Rutan Long-EZ out for a series of touch-and-go landings at the Monterey Peninsula Airport. According to the airplane mechanic who was working with Denver just prior to his final departure, things were not right with the singer's homemade experimental airplane, which he had purchased 2 weeks earlier. The main problem? The aircraft's fuel tank switch and fuel gauge were located behind the pilot's seat, making it impossible for Denver to safely fly solo. Yet despite low fuel levels, unsafe cockpit conditions, and operating his plane with a revoked flying license, Denver took the airplane out over Monterey Bay near Pacific Grove, California. He wasn't in the air for more than 10 minutes before witnesses saw the aircraft sputter and go silent, sending Denver nosediving into the Pacific Ocean. On December 10, 1967, only 3 days after he recorded his iconic Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay, Otis Redding and most of his backing band, the Bar-Kays, died when their Beechcraft H-18 airplane crashed into Lake Manana. The most unique thing about the flight that took Redding's life is that the cause of the crash was never determined. The only bit of knowledge we have about the incident comes from Bar-Kays member Ben Cauley, the accident's only survivor. Cauley, who was sleeping for most of the 400-mile flight, woke up just before impact to see his bandmate, saxophonist Phalon Jones, look out a window and exclaim, "Oh no." Cauley said the last thing he remembered before the Beechcraft hit the lake was unbuckling his seatbelt. He then found himself in frigid water, grasping a seat cushion to keep afloat. Redding's body was recovered the next day when the lake was searched. Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay would be released about a month later on January 8th and immediately go to number 1 on the U.S. Billboard Hot 100, selling over 3 million copies worldwide. Two days after she performed at a benefit in Kansas City, Patsy Cline was finally able to board the Piper PA-24 Comanche airplane, which had been chartered to fly her back home to Nashville. It had been grounded due to foggy weather up to that point. Cline finally boarded the small Piper aircraft 2 days after her performance on March 5, 1963, making a quick stop at Dyersburg Municipal Airport in Dyersburg, Tennessee at 5 p.m. Upon landing in Dyersburg, the airport's field manager strongly suggested to Cline that she stay the night because of high winds and inclement weather. He even enticed her entourage of 4 with free rooms and meals. Unfortunately, Randy Hughes, Cline's manager and pilot that day, who was not trained in instrument flying, declined the offer and said, "I've already come this far. We'll be there before you know it." Approximately 13 minutes after their departure, the Piper nosedived into a forest outside of Camden, approximately 90 miles from its destination. Of course, Cline's demise could have been avoided if she accepted Dottie West's request 2 days earlier. According to West, Cline's close friend and a fellow musician who also performed at the Kansas City benefit, she had asked the singer if she wanted to accompany her on a car ride back to Nashville. Cline refused what would be a 16-hour road trip, telling West, "Don't worry about me, Hoss. When it's my time to go, it's my time." American folk and rock singer-songwriter Jim Croce died on September 20th, 1973, one day before the lead single to his 5th album, I Got a Name, was released. The crash happened well after sunset, but there were slightly foggy skies, calm winds, and 5 miles of visibility. As Croce's chartered Beechcraft E-18S lifted off from the Natchitoches Airport in Natchitoches, Louisiana, its pilot clipped a lone pecan tree at the end of the runway. Investigators initially reported that the conditions were clear enough for a safe flight, but it was later revealed that Croce's 57-year-old pilot suffered from severe coronary artery disease and had run 3 miles to the airport from a motel before takeoff, which heavily factored into the crash. A week after Croce's death, his widow, Ingrid, received a letter he mailed a couple days before he died. In it, Croce told his wife he was exhausted from his relentless touring and expressed a desire to quit the music business and take up other pursuits, such as writing screenplays and short stories, work that wouldn't take him so far from his family. Croce closed the letter by writing, "Remember, it's the first 60 years that count, and I've got 30 to go. I love you." It's what's become one of rock and roll's most legendary airplane tragedies. Ronnie Van Zant, lead singer and primary songwriter for Lynyrd Skynyrd, died at the age of 29 after he and his band's Convair CV-240 crashed into a heavily forested area 5 miles northeast of Gillsburg, Mississippi. The incident happened on October 20th, 1977, about 60 miles away from the band's destination in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where they were scheduled to appear at LSU the following night. Unlike most airplane crashes on this list, Van Zant and the other 23 passengers were warned. They were told by their pilots to brace for an emergency landing when their airplane ran out of fuel. Of the 26 people on board, Van Zant and 5 other people, including guitarist and vocalist Steve Gaines, died on impact when the plane skimmed about 100 yards along the top of the tree line before splitting into pieces near Gillsburg. Van Zant bandmate, drummer Artimus Pyle, later recalled a conversation he had with the singer when Skynyrd was touring Japan earlier that year. "Ronnie told me that he would never live to see 30, and that he would go out with his boots on. In other words, on the road." The circumstances of the airplane crash that took the lives of Ricky Nelson, his band, and his girlfriend swarms in mystery to this day. Reports differ, but the facts are Nelson and his entourage took off in his 14-seat 1944 Douglas DC-3 from Guntersville, Alabama. This was after finishing a gig and en route to Champaign, Illinois, where his band was to perform at a big New Year's Eve show in Dallas, Texas. The DC crash landed outside of DeKalb, Texas, in a cow pasture less than 2 miles from a landing strip, and that's where accounts of the crash differ. One of the two pilots who survived the crash landing by escaping out of the cockpit window claims the airplane was on fire because its cabin heater, and we quote, was acting up. The second pilot claims the cabin was filled with smoke but seemed safe to land. And then there were reports that a fire started due to an accident involving freebasing drugs. Ultimately, after a year-long investigation, the National Transportation Safety Board finally concluded that a definite cause of the tragedy was unknown. It's what's referred to as the day the music died. Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and Richardson boarded a small airplane on February 3, 1959, to avoid the horrible conditions of their tour bus. 5 minutes later, the small aircraft crashed into a cornfield in Clear Lake, Iowa. The tragedy is now part of rock and roll lore. Holly had had enough of the miserable touring conditions on the Winter Dance Party tour across the Midwest he was headlining. The road trips between gigs were long and cold, and most artists on the review were suffering from colds or flus. Some even got frostbite. Frustrated by the conditions, Holly decided to ditch the tour bus and charter a V-tailed Beechcraft 35 Bonanza to reach the tour's next gig in Moorhead, Minnesota. With 2 spare seats, he invited his bandmates Waylon Jennings and Tommy Allsup on board. But fate changed music history forever. At the last minute, Jennings gave up his seat to the Big Bopper, who was suffering from a debilitating flu. And just as it's depicted in the 1987 film La Bamba, Valens won Allsup's seat in a coin flip. And with that, Holly, Valens, and Richardson hopped aboard the Beechcraft at 12:55 a.m. The trio and their pilot were last seen ascending northwest in a light snowfall. By 1 a.m., the airport that the musicians departed from lost contact with the pilot. The airplane was found the following day, smashed into a ball of twisted metal in a Clear Lake, Iowa cornfield. Holly and Valens' bodies had been ejected from the fuselage near the wreckage. Richardson's body had been thrown over the fence into a neighboring cornfield, hitting the ground at an estimated 170 miles per hour, cartwheeling across the frozen field for 540 feet. The local coroner certified that all 3 musicians and the pilot perished instantly due to pilot error. Every one of these deaths mentioned could have been avoided if someone with authority like a manager or mechanic or even the pilot would have stepped in. But egos and a sense of being indestructible led to the loss of some of the music industry's greatest voices. So what do you think? Who did we miss? Which deceased musician were you surprised not to see on our list? Let us know in the comments below, and check out some of these other music stories from our weird history.